Hello there, it's me again, Paul at Nutrient Nirvana. I'm joined, as you can see, once again by author and researcher Ralph Ellis, who's here to give us his analysis of the current situation in the Ukraine. So, Ralph, how are you today?
Very well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on again.
My pleasure, glad to hear it. Okay, so it's a very volatile situation, as we know. I've been kind of flitting in and out of it, so to speak, with mainstream articles. Um, And to be quite honest with you, over the last couple of days, I've started to feel quite disillusioned with the whole situation, and in particular with our leaders, our governments. It all seems to be escalating out of control, and I think after the last 2 years that everyone has had, the very last thing we need is a bloody world war. So, to be quite honest with you, Ralph, you are my main source of information on this at the moment because I have followed it, but as I say, I'm finding it increasingly depressing that more can't be done to salvage the situation. So over to you, mate. Really, I mean, how do you see things progressing?
Yes, it's a very difficult situation. Wish we weren't in this situation. I mean, it's a very stupid thing for Putin to have gone and tried, but we'll go through perhaps some of the reasons why he did try this
Mhm.
move. And I suppose the other thing you brought up there is should we be armchair generals sitting there here, giving the advice when we're not there and we don't have the experience to give that information? But I think it is valuable because if you're looking at the legacy media, those people are armchair generals as well. They don't know anything about the situation. And from what I've seen of their reporting, they know far less than we do. So I think this is valuable to get a slightly different insight into the situation. And we also have armchair generals in politics as well. And that's the real disappointing part is we can't trust the people who are supposed to be guiding us. Um, I don't know if you saw Kamala Harris when she went over to Poland. Um,
When was this?
it was just about two days ago.
I must have.
Um, Giving support to Poland, and she was asked about the situation in Ukraine, and she said, "Well, Russia is a big country, and Ukraine is a smaller country,
Yes, I
and
did
the
see
big
that.
country is attacking the smaller." And you hold on a minute.
Yeah.
These people are supposed to be in charge of our response to this situation, and you get brain dead idiots like Kamala Harris,
Well,
who's
perhaps she thinks that most people are very stupid. I don't know.
she talks to everyone like children. She's
Yeah.
utterly ridiculous. How she ever got into that position, nobody knows. In fact, we all know how she got into that position. She should never be there in the first place.
Mm.
Um,
I think she's the most
she's
unpopular vice president of all time, isn't she?
Yeah, but she was even before that. Even during the election, she was the most um, unpopular person in the election there's ever been. In the
Mm,
Democrat election for who was going to be the candidate for president.
mm,
And this is true across a lot of politics. I suppose it's always been like this, but I do despair sometimes. She's almost as bad as our Diane Abacus
oh dear.
in our parliament.
Yep.
And I don't know if you saw her. She was on the radio, and she said
No,
that.
I've met her on a couple of occasions because my grandfather worked in politics for years and knew her quite well. So
Right,
that
right.
was a long time ago. But yeah, I'm not a fan.
No, well, she was on saying that her party would increase the number of police. Um, she said we will recruit another 10,000 policemen, and so the interviewer said, "Well, what on earth's that going to cost?" And she said, "Well, we've costed it out that over a 4-year period, it will cost about £300,000."
What? Oh my God.
That's why they call her Diane Abacus. Um, but these are the people who are leading our response to this, dreadful
Mm,
international situation, and they know nothing about it. They're
mm,
just incompetent. And why do people vote for these people? I don't know.
They're just puppets, aren't they, Ralph?
Yeah, well, yes. Yes, they are. The wrong people often get chosen. The same happens in industry sometimes as well, where, you know, managers are chosen, you know, they're demoted upwards, you know, through the hierarchy. You know, if they're really incompetent, you shove them sideways and upwards. And these people get into politics, and it's very unfortunate. But I have to say I was more or less correct in my previous assessment that this would not go well for Russia, based on my experience of living in Russia. That there's a lot of sort of emperor's new clothes around there. You know, it looks good on paper, but it might not work quite so well when you actually put it into practice, which is why I said that sometimes it's better to saber rattle on the sidelines rather than actually going to war and proving that you're incompetent, which is, I think, what Putin has just gone and done. He ran into the two problems that I highlighted, which is mud and breakdowns. They should have waited. I mean, if I think the army would have been saying, no, wait, either go midwinter, and it wasn't a very cold winter, so it didn't freeze. So that didn't help them. I'm sure the army would have been saying, wait, you know, go in the summer. But I presume Putin was, you know, champing at the bit. I can't wait any longer. Go. And of course, it's just a quagmire. And they can't go anywhere. So they're stuck on the roads, and that's a real problem. Having all of these convoys on nice little roads where you know exactly where they're going to go. Very nice for ambushes, you know, and that's what it's proved to be. And the missing Air Force as well, which I predicted. That, you know, in the 21st century is a real problem. I mean, it should not be like this for a first world army, that they've lost their Air Force. It's just not present on the battlefield. They should have gained, you know, with something like Ukraine, they should have gained air superiority within the first week. And then you can use your aircraft to back up your ground forces. I mean, I'm no military strategician, but I do know that, you know, sending tanks out along a road without ground support and without air support is not the thing to do. You're hiding to nothing if you do that sort of thing. And they don't have air superiority, so they can't. These aircraft, okay, Ukraine have got a lot of, you know, Stinger missiles and so on, so you can't hang around at low level. But Stingers only go up to 15,000 foot. So you could hang around at high level, and you could be bringing in guided missiles to help your ground troops from way above, you know, the same as America does, you know, when they were out in Afghanistan and so on. Whatever you think about this, you know, as a tactic for war, that's how you do it. The ground crew call up and say, can we have air support? That building over there, you know, is stuffed full of machine guns. Can you take it out, please? And they don't have that capability. So the ground troops are on their own, and they're getting bogged down. They're getting picked off time and time again. And we've got these new weapons, of course. Well, I suppose they're not new. I'm talking about the anti-tank sort of munitions that they're using very successfully. They've always had those. You know, if you don't have ground support, people are going to sneak up on your tanks. I mean, in the Second World War, we used to have the sticky bomb, which was not a very good idea, but it sort of worked, where you stick a bomb on the side of the tank as it rolls past you. And if you don't have troops out on the ground to protect your tank, that's what's going to happen to it. I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you've gone to the tank museum down at Bovingdon, all of the German tanks have plaster on the side of them. And you think, well, what on earth is that for?
Mm.
That's no protection against missiles. It's to stop the sticky bombs, because it was supposed to repel the sticky bombs and make them fall off, so you
Wow.
didn't get blown up. And then the Germans came out with, of course, the Panzerfaust, which was a very advanced weapon, very close range, which is one of these shaped charge. It was the first shaped charge weapon. They were the first people to think that this was a good idea. And it just shoots a gob of white hot copper at the tank. And it's so fast and it's so hot, it'll just go straight through it.
Wow.
And that's what they're using now in the NLAW, the British NLAW anti-tank missile. So, what we've got, it's almost going back to sort of medieval warfare, this thing. We've got a simple commoner. It's like the English yeoman, in Henry V, Part 1. An Englishman with his longbow taking out the, heavily armored cavalry of the French.
Mm.
And you've got the same. You've got a lowly little infantryman with an anti-tank weapon taking out these very, very expensive pieces of kit, whether it's tanks or rocket launchers or APCs, Army Personnel Carriers, I think they call them, or the convoys, all of their equipment and so on.
Mm.
So it's a real problem. I think, after this is all over, they'll be writing, verses about this particular conflict, saying, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for today that he sheds his blood with me, he shall be my brother. Be here ne'er so vile that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. If you know your Shakespeare, it's the same thing, it's the lowly troops taking out these vast convoys of mechanized armies, and very successfully too.
What do you make of the legacy media's current coverage of this? Because seeing a couple of pieces today, it reminded me of Orwell's 1984, when the public were allowed 2 minutes of hate a day, when they could shout and scream and wave their fist in the general direction of Emmanuel Goldstein, I think it was, the enemy of the state. I mean, you could just replace that with Putin now, couldn't you? It really is. It's childish. I mean,
they do like a devil character, that.
Yeah, like Bin
The
Laden.
legacy media have a hero and a villain, and nothing in between. And so, okay, we want to go against Putin. So he's not just, a bad man or an evil man. No, he has to be mad. He's got to be completely off his rocker. No, he just has a different point of view. And okay, it might be an evil, but evil doesn't mean mad, we wish that, he wasn't there. That might be so, but to characterize him as being mad is lazy, because you can't understand the character if you just say he's lost his mind, and he hasn't.
Would you characterize him as a psychopath?
No, I think he's very rational, but he's operating from a very different point of view. He's operating from the Russian point of view, and of course the Russians live in a very, very different world to the world we live in. When I was living in Russia, they used to say things to me like, the West did nothing during the Second World War. We were the only people fighting Germany for 4 years. We were the only people fighting him until the end of 1944, when you made an invasion. And that's their view of the Second World War. No idea of the North African campaigns, no idea about the Pacific theater, no idea about the invasion of Italy and all of that sort of business, or the air war, where we used to have 1,000 bomber raids over Germany. No idea of that. So their point of view was based on that we were sitting there twiddling our thumbs for 4 years, and Russia was the only country fighting. Well, they have the same problem in the modern era, that they are so And this is the problem with having so much fake legacy media and indoctrination and propaganda, is that you live in your little propaganda bubble. And Putin is living in his little propaganda bubble, and he believes it. So from that perspective of his little bubble, he's very rational. The trouble is that most of the bubble he's living in was based on half-truths, lies, fake media, and his own internal propaganda. And he probably believed it all as well, because you always have this problem in tyrannies like Russia, that nobody dares challenge the boss. And so it's emperor's new clothes again. Everybody tells the boss what he wants to hear. Is our army capable of going straight into Ukraine? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Do the Ukrainians love us? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course they do. Never mind about the Russian Holodnor, which of course the Russians haven't forgotten. The Ukrainians haven't forgotten, where Russia killed, 7 million Ukrainians in the Great Famine. Of course, the Ukrainians haven't forgotten that, but the advisors are not going to tell Putin about that. And he believed it, and his troops believed it as well. I was just watching on TV. There was a lineup of Russians who had been captured, and they were being asked about their experience in the war. And obviously they've chosen Russians who were fed up with the war. They probably had 500 people to choose from, and they chose the people who were most, Ukraine supporting. But their stories were really interesting, very emotional, that they were on exercises, and that's what they believed. And then they said, the commanders said, right, we're moving into Ukraine now on a peacekeeping mission. Give us all of your identification. So they had to hand in all of their ID cards, their passports, their mobile phones. Everything was taken. All of their IDs were taken from them, and all of their communication methods. And then they were packed off on these convoys, and they had no idea where they were going. So they had no maps, no GPS, because they've put GPS blockers out, so you can't use GPS. So these guys were just following this convoy, not knowing where they were going. They only realized they were in Ukraine when all the roadsides changed into Ukrainian instead of Russian. And they said, we're in Ukraine now. So they pushed on up into Ukraine, and their transporter that this guy was driving broke down. Typical problem that we were talking about. So it was obviously very valuable. So they left some people to guard it with them while they stayed there trying to fix it. And the rest of the brigade pushed on. They went, 10, 20 miles up the road. And then they could hear on the radio that their brigade had just been taken out by the Ukrainians. And they were going in expecting roses and flowers, and suddenly their brigade has just been taken out. And they go, what in the hell do we do? So they set fire to their trucks and whatever it was carrying, and walked back to Russia. And they walked for 4 days going back to Russia before they were captured by the Ukrainians. I mean, the whole thing just sounds like an absolute disaster from start to finish. Forcing people to go into war is not necessarily the best way of doing it. You've really got to carry your troops with you, rather than pointing a gun at their back and saying, march forwards. And that's not the way that Russia has ever done it. If you've read anything about Stalingrad, they didn't motivate their troops. They just had brigades behind them that if anyone retreated, they just blasted them. So you had no choice. If you were at Stalingrad, you had to be there, because you'd be killed on both sides. And there was more likelihood you'd be killed by the Russians than killed by the Germans. So, and they're trying the same trick again. So there was no attempt to, tell the troops what the goals were, carry them with you on this this expedition. The troops had no idea what they were doing, and these weren't even conscripts. You know, these were seasoned troops. I mean, he said he had been in the army for 10 years, so you know he knew the game.
So it sounds as though Putin is just digging himself a massive hole, basically, at the
Yeah,
moment. Yeah,
he is. Based on limited information, because he's not being given the full information of what's there on the ground, and he's not being given the full information about the capabilities of the Russian army. Although he should have some idea about it, because I mean, there's been a litany of Russian losses in the past, which should have, you know, guided him a bit more if he knows his history. That's why history is important. That's why we study history, you know, like Egyptian history and biblical history, you know. Otherwise, you're doomed to repeat the same failures, which is exactly what he's doing. Because if you've read the history of the Winter War, which was Russia's invasion of Finland in 1938, before the Second World War. So why didn't we go to war with Russia to protect Finland instead of going to war with Germany to protect Poland? You know, because Russia threw 400,000 troops at Finland in 1938 to take over Finland, and they were soundly defeated by little Finland, all on their own, because no one backed up Finland. And it reads very much like the Ukrainian invasion. Mechanical breakdowns, tanks being picked off left, right, and center by, you know, individual troops with Molotov cocktails, no less, because they didn't have much else to use.
But in this situation, the Ukraine is getting a lot of help from the West, isn't it?
Oh yes, yes, yeah. They wouldn't have been able to do it, I don't think, without our assistance. Yeah, I mean, it's not readily well known that, you know, after the well, they wouldn't have had if Russia had been a bit more canny. They only got this support because of Crimea. So after Crimea, people started waking up to the possibilities. America didn't do much because Obama only gave Ukraine blankets, which was not very helpful. Thank you very much. But Britain sent over instructors and weaponry called Operation Optic, I think it was. So we've been in Ukraine teaching the Ukrainian army for 7 years. It's been a long-term.
It's been brewing for a long time, yeah.
Yeah, it's been going for a long time. Teaching mainly command and control, because there's no point having troops on the ground if you can't control them, which is a problem that Russia has got, because their brand spanking new secret communications software and hardware that they've produced is not working. So they're using telephones, you know, which is a real problem, because all of their communications can be intercepted. So for some reason, their new system is not working very well. But anyway, the British went into Ukraine with Operation Optic to teach the Western military techniques and command and control to make sure that everybody knows what they're exactly doing, and it seems to have worked. They seem to be much more using tactics that are much more suited to the position they're in. So the Russians are stuck on these roads, which is a real problem, as I said, you know, a couple of weeks ago. They've got very thin lines of communication because they decided to attack on 3 fronts all the way around this huge, great country. So they've spread their forces very thinly. Instead of saying, you know, we're going to come in from the north with an entire army, they've spread themselves out through the whole of Ukraine. They're stuck on the roads and they don't control the countryside. and that's just it's not what you want to do. It's a complete calamity because every convoy that is going down those roads is open to small forces picking them off. What do they call it? Where you get small guerrilla forces roaming the countryside. Anyway, that's what they've got. They've got small forces, Ukrainian forces, running around the countryside on foot quite often, or in small, like Land Rovers, with just a few anti-tank missiles, which are not very heavy. They're only 30 kilos each. They're small and light, disposable, and they're a very effective force against, massed troops who are stuck on a road, and can't really go anywhere. And of course, the Russians, when they were being intercepted like this, dashed out across the countryside to get away from, the little skirmish, and got stuck in the mud. And so you've got all of these very expensive bits of kit stuck in the mud, left, right, and center, and just being abandoned because you can't do it. I mean, a tank that's been beached in a muddy field is useless, and they're just being abandoned. And farmers all over Ukraine are taking away these very expensive pieces of kit, even if it's only for scrap value. They've had to invent a new law now in Ukraine. So the government is still functioning, and they've just passed a new law apparently, saying that farmers can commandeer equipment if they find it on their lands, but they have to pay tax if they sell it. Because so many farmers have got, tanks sitting in their barns that they've just taken out of the fields because they got stuck there, Complete mess from start to finish.
Exactly. A complete mess. Just so I can understand, the viewers can understand where Russia is coming from on this, really. As I understand it, basically they have three demands: that the Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO, that Lugansk and Donetsk should be allowed to break away from the Ukraine, and the Crimea should be allowed to join the Russian Federation. That's what I can ascertain. I mean, do you understand? Did you sympathise with that kind of thinking?
I not entirely, no, because the Donetsk did have a vote on this. Now that's the Russian side of Ukraine. We just had a little glitch there. I'll just say that again in case we timed out there. Donetsk is the Russian part of Ukraine with a lot of Russian speakers there. And I did think they would be more amenable to being a part of Russia. But they did have a vote on this some years back after the Crimean intervention. And they actually voted against it. So the three options apparently on the voting slip were to be part of Ukraine, to be part of Russia, or to be independent. And all of these disputed provinces over in the east voted to be independent. They didn't actually want to be a part of Russia.
Okay.
So, and the experience, I thought they would be more welcoming to the Russians when the Russians came in on the eastern side there. But apparently not. A lot of these cities on the east have been resisting very valiantly. They don't want the Russians there, which I was a little bit surprised about. I thought they would want it a bit more, but apparently not. They really don't want the Russians there either, despite their sort of Russian heritage of some of the people living there. I don't think this is a modification that Putin is coming out with. These weren't the goals he wanted whatsoever. He wanted the whole of Ukraine. He's having to backtrack a little bit now because he's obviously got bogged down in something that he was not expecting whatsoever. I think he was expecting a sort of Operation Desert Storm, where you roll over there in the countryside in a week or two and take the whole of Ukraine.
Mm.
But of course, he hasn't got that because his equipment won't work in that fashion. I mean, for instance, when the Americans went in with Desert Storm, and they had the Battle of 73 Easting, which was one of the opening battles in Desert Storm. The Americans went through and they knocked out 350 Iraqi tanks and only lost one Bradley fighting vehicle. Now, that should have been telling Putin something. I mean, he must have known about things like this. When the Syrians came across from the east into Israel in the Yom Kippur War, they went through what's now called the Valley of Tears, where they lost 260 tanks to the Israelis losing 20 very old, refurbished American and British tanks. The Russian equipment did not perform very well. And I suppose he could have convinced himself that it was the operator's fault, that it was just Syrians and Iraqis using this equipment. And of course, the Russians will be much better. But they're not really actually having much better experience with their equipment than the Iraqis or the Syrians. So where were we going with this? What was the question initially?
What was the question? I made 3 points on why.
Oh yes, his demands.
Yeah.
For ending the war. Yeah, he's modified those demands, but in the circumstances, if you were a Ukrainian and you've seen what's happened over the last 3 weeks, why would you accept those terms? You've just delivered a bloody nose to what's supposed to be, a world superpower, and ground them almost to a halt within 3 weeks. Would you go to the negotiating table and voluntarily give up, large parts of your nation, just because Putin had invaded? I think they're going to try for a little bit more, the Ukrainians. And, that's not unreasonable, I would say, in the circumstances. I mean, going back to what we were saying 2 weeks ago about this, the Ukrainians probably didn't play this very well initially, because I was making that comparison between Ukraine and Odessa as both being the meat in a sort of empire sandwich. And the Odessans, I think, played it rather better than the Ukrainians did. The whole point of being this what would you call it? Not a peace force, but anyway, a buffer state in between two empires. You've got to be very canny at playing both empires off against each other. So you can't favor one too much over the other, which is why the Odessans were always known as the perfidious Odessans, because they would never side with one of the empires for too long. They would then go and favor the other empire because their position was so precarious, stuck in the middle of these two empires between Parthia and Rome. And Ukraine was in the same position between Russia and effectively the EU and America together on the other side. And they rather favored the EU too much. If they had been wiser, I think they would have stayed a little bit more independent. And then they would not have provoked Russia in the way that they did. But of course, Putin got on his high horse because he saw Ukraine favoring the EU. And that forced his hand. Well, he didn't have to force his hand, but he thought it had to. I think the problem being there that there's a big disparity, or a reasonable disparity, between the standard of living in the EU and the standard of living in Russia. And of course, as a Ukrainian, when you're looking at this, thinking, well, which side do I want to be allied to the most?
Mm.
Well, they were favoring the EU, but a little bit too much. And that may have precipitated this war. If they had stayed more independent and just sat on the fence a little bit more, we might not be in this situation.
Mm. So could we be witnessing the demise of Russia as a major player on the world stage, or a superpower?
Yeah, Russia has lost already.
Mm.
It matters not what happens from now on. Russia
Mm.
has lost. They've lost because they've lost economically. They've been ostracized from the rest of the economic world, and that will have a knock-on effect to its economy for the next 10, 20 years or more.
Mm.
And they've lost their status because,
Mm.
as you say, they had this world stage status that they were
Mm.
the world's second superpower, probably still above China.
Mm.
And now they're not, because they've just proved that the emperor has no clothes.
Well, I was going to say, actually, is there any possibility, do you think, that Russia might reach out to China in some
Oh,
way?
they have already. They have. They've started building a gas pipeline into China recently. They've got agreements on that. China is playing a canny hand, as they often do. They're not saying too much, but of course they will ally themselves, because China doesn't like America, and China will do anything to, put a spanner in the spokes of America's wheels. And so, yes, of course, China will do trade with Russia. And that might be a big enough trading bloc that Russia won't suffer too much. But in terms of their status, they have already lost. They've just proven that their status as a first world military power is based on nothing. Their tanks don't work properly. Their tactics don't work properly. Their communications don't work properly. Their aircraft are not to be seen anywhere on the stage whatsoever. So there's no point having these wonderful, brand new super duper aircraft out of Russia. These are going to kill their exports quite a lot, I reckon. There's no point having these wonderful aircraft if they cannot perform when they're asked to do so. And it's the worst advertisement you can possibly get for Russian equipment. Apart from being cheap, why would anyone want Russian equipment now when the aircraft are all sitting on the ground doing nothing, or they can't support the troops because there's a thin layer of ground underneath, of cloud underneath, and they don't have radar capability, or they're all on the ground because they're broken down and they don't actually work, that they don't have sufficient guided missile systems, and they're just using dumb bombs because they don't have any or sufficient guided bombs to maintain a combat air patrol, and just patrol over the skies of Ukraine and take out units as they're radioed up to them. They're just not doing that. So yeah, Russia has lost. They will, for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, they're just not going to be taken seriously as a.
So, in terms of sanctions against Russia, Ralph, would you say that they were self-harming? Because all prices are skyrocketing everywhere in the West. In this country, we've had 25p increase for a litre of fuel. We've got stagflation everywhere. So, really speaking, I mean, are these sanctions worth it? I mean, surely we're just punishing our own people, aren't we?
Yes, we are, but I think they're still necessary. You've got to be able to put pressure on Russia to stop them, sending naked aggression against their neighbors. It's the only way to do it. But we're really punishing ourselves because we're the architects of our own downfall in this respect in terms of energy. We should have been energy independent decades ago. I've been banging the drum about this for the last 30 years, ever since, the North Sea oil started to drop off. It was obvious that we'd reached peak oil in terms of North Sea oil back in the 90s. And nobody seems to have learnt from that. So America, the first thing Biden did was he signed a declaration to stop the oil pipeline down from Alaska. So now America is not energy independent, and they're reliant on not so much Russian, but certainly Middle Eastern oil. And they're chasing around looking for more supplies at present because they don't have sufficient supplies. Germany, of course, using Russian gas. Everybody knew that that was a problem, and maybe they shouldn't be doing that. I don't know if you've seen the videos of Trump lambasting these people for. He had all of the politicians, all of the German politicians, around a table and telling them they were utterly stupid for having Nord Stream 2. And they're all sort of, smiling and laughing at him. Well, they're not smiling and laughing now. Germany has a real problem, which is why their stock market crashed an awful lot more than ours did, because everybody knows they're dependent on German gas. And we need more independence. And renewables are not going to cut the grade. It's too intermittent. And nobody in the world that I know of has started to put in backup systems for renewable energy. They're not even discussing it, let alone putting in the systems, because they are too expensive. So, for the UK, if we want to go fully renewables, we need something like 20,000 gigawatt hours of stored backup energy, probably through pump storage water backup, like the Dinorwig plant in Wales. So we need about 20,000 gigawatt hours. At present, we only have 10 gigawatt hours. So we have nowhere near the stored capability to make renewables work. I mean, at present, renewables are only working because we're relying on gas. And we used to be relying on coal to back it up. Well, sorry, if you want to get rid of that gas because you want renewables, you're going to need some other backup system. And we don't have it. And of course, nobody is costing in those backup systems to the full cost of renewable energy, because to get 20,000 gigawatt hours of stored backup, that's going to be expensive. And where would you put them? Because everywhere you want to put them is going to be an area of outstanding natural beauty. And they're going to say, no, you're not allowed to do it. I mean, the one in Wales, Dinorwig, fantastic site, actually. If you're interested in engineering and technology, absolutely fantastic site. Because it was in Snowdonia, they made them put the power station inside a mountain. So they hollowed out the inside of a mountain with a cavern that's bigger than St. Paul's Cathedral and put the power station in there. Fine, wonderful piece of technology, but you can imagine the cost of trying to do that. Hugely expensive. And you just could not do that to back up all of the renewables. And if we're going to have problems and maintain energy independence, we're going to need something like that, unless you go for the nuclear route. And France, of course, are quite happily sitting there with, 80% of their energy comes from the electrical energy, not fuel for transport and everything else. But 80% of their electrical energy comes from nuclear, and they're sitting there quite happy at present. Whereas I think we've got about 10% comes from nuclear. And of course, Germany, under Madame Merkel, dear old Merkel, trying to ruin Germany, closed down all of her nuclear power stations because of Fukushima. And you've got to wonder what planet these politicians are on. You know, all of Germany's power stations, nuclear power stations, are inland. So they're not exactly going to suffer from a tsunami. But there we go. Anyway, so they're closing them all down, and they've just had to stop closing down the last 3 because they've suddenly run out of electricity. So we need some forward planning, and we've not had any forward planning for the last 20 years. We need a real discussion about how we're going to work this. If we want renewables, where are you going to put the backup systems? What type of backup systems are you going to use? The only one that's credible at present is pumped water storage. All of the other ones just simply don't have the energy capacity. You can't use batteries. It doesn't. Everyone has been shouting about the one in South Australia that was put down there by Musk to back up South Australia because they lost their grid because of renewables down there. And they're thinking, wow, that's wonderful. He's got battery storage. Yeah, but that battery storage only works for 30 seconds. That's not going to keep you going. You know, that's the problem with batteries. He's got this. It was one of the biggest battery packs, I think, that's ever been put together, but it still only will keep them going for 30 seconds. So we need a proper discussion on where we're going to get this energy from, especially if they want to get rid of fossil fuels for heating and for transport, because the split is 25% of energy goes for electricity. 25 or 30% goes for transport. The rest of it goes on industry and space heating in your house, basically, or in your factory, office blocks, wherever you work. That's the split. So getting your electricity from renewables is just a small part of the equation. It's only a quarter of the equation. If you want to get rid of fossil fuels, and that includes everything else, you're going to need to triple the number of power stations. And where are they being built? They're not. You're going to need, as I say, thousands of times more stored backup energy in order to keep things going. Or we're going to need an awful lot more nuclear power stations. And people will not discuss these important problems. If we're going to run out of not just Russian oil, but run out of Middle Eastern oil, because, I mean, that's not exactly a stable part of the world, is it? North African oil, again, not entirely the most stable part of the world. If we need energy independence, we need to be discussing these difficult problems. Where are you going to use? Where are you going to get it from? What source? How much is these units going to cost? How long are they going to take to build? And nobody is discussing it because everybody in government is a half-wit. I mean, our prime minister at present is well, effectively, it's Carrie Antoinette. I don't know if you've heard of her nickname, dear old Carrie. She's known as Carrie Antoinette because she tells people to eat cake if they have no bread, you know. The prime minister's wife. I think we should be heading for thorium power is the only way to really get to grips with this problem. Thorium is another nuclear fuel, but it's much safer than the standard uranium plutonium route that we took. The only reason we took the uranium route was because you can make bombs out of it. And a lot of the money, of course, came from the military. Whereas the thorium power, you cannot make bombs from thorium. And so only one reactor, thorium reactor, has ever been made, which was in America in the 1960s. And it worked. Okay, there's still problems with it, but we've had, 60 years of technology advances since then. They had some problems with the metallurgy. the metals were being attacked by the nuclear radiation in the core.
Mm.
But it worked. They showed that it worked. And the thing with thorium power is that you cannot make bombs from it. The nuclear residue is all short half-life. We're only talking hundreds of years instead of thousands of years.
Mm.
So it has a different decay chain to uranium, plutonium.
Mm.
And what else? Oh yes, we've got 1,000 years of supply just sitting there already. Because at present it's just it's a byproduct of mining,
Mm.
and you can't use it. So it's just being stockpiled in
Mm.
great heaps. So we've got all of this thorium just sitting there, ready to be used. But of course, we've got politicians in charge who don't even know what thorium is, let alone the fact that we could be using it, for our energy supply systems,
Mm.
because we've got dullards as politicians.
Mm.
And we need a serious discussion about where we're going to go with this, because the planning, of course, for nuclear power stations, you're talking 20 years of planning before you're going to get any power out of anything.
Mm.
So we need these discussions now. And
Mm.
hopefully, if any good is going to come out of Putin's wild escapade, is it might prompt people to have some more serious questions
Mm.
about what is important in society. So, stop us talking about, whether a man is a woman and a woman is a man, and actually think about the things that are important in
Mm.
society. Where
Mm.
we're going to get our energy from. Can we have some discussions about this? What our security is going to look like in the future? Can we have some discussions about this, please? Perhaps people will start getting more serious again. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just a
I
hope.
completely agree with all that. I read somewhere recently that the trans agenda, if you like, the clouding of the genders and the confusion and all that is deliberate, and it's guiding us towards a transhumanist future, if you like. That's the whole point of it. I don't know if you
Um,
would concur with that at all.
I, I wouldn't. It's deliberate, yes, but
Mm.
I wouldn't say it's pointing in that point of view. I think this is just standard Marxism. Marxism has been trying to take over the world for you might almost say hundreds of years, but certainly in the last 100 years.
Mm.
And what Marxism likes to do is divide and rule. And so what they had over the 20th century was a real attempt to divide society along class lines. Because if you can divide, if you can set the workers against the bosses, you can overturn the society and
Mm.
overturn the establishment, which is
Mm.
basically what they wanted. That's what they got
Mm.
in Russia, and look how that turned out. But in the West, they never really succeeded because the working man was rich enough to be happy and not
Mm.
want a revolution. Why would you want a revolution if you've got your own house, your own car, your nice
Mm.
family, you've got a reasonable life? Okay, you're not a billionaire, but who wants to be a billionaire? They have their own
Mm.
problems. I've got my nice life. I'm the referee at the local football club. It keeps me busy, and we have a nice life. We have holiday every year. Why would you want a Marxist revolution? Well, you don't, and they failed.
Mm.
So what they've tried to do now is divide society along racial lines
Mhm.
and divide society along sexuality, because all they're interested in is divisions, divide and rule. And that's what they've tried over the last, 3, 4,
Yeah.
5 years
And if I
is,
might be brave enough just to add to that, we had a conversation a little while ago about the Tartarian theory that's
mm,
appeared on the internet, and I know that you don't want to give it the oxygen of publicity at all, but
no,
I would just add to what you've just said. It's kind of, as you put it, I think disconnecting us from our true history.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
It-
Well, that's what Marxism does. Mao did it when he took over China. He rewrote the history of China.
mm,
And the Marxists in Russia did much the same. They rewrote
mm,
their history.
mm.
And yet history is important. Tradition is important. You know, there's a lot of people trying to turn over, to mock tradition and overturn it. But tradition exists because it is successful. In Darwinian terms, it's a successful strategy. It's like any sort of, you know, reaction in the animal world. You know, that a cat, when it's surprised by a dog, will stick its hair up and hiss, because that's a successful strategy against an attack by a feline. And we have these traditions which have been successful over hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, and we call it tradition. And we stick to it because it works, and it's shown that it's worked. And if you're going to turn everything upside down, well, maybe your system is just not going to work, as the Russians found out, as the Chinese found out.
This reminds me of Barack Obama's campaign to become president, and the key word was change. Change is good. We need to change.
Yes.
Change this, change that. And I saw a meme the other day on Facebook, and it said, "Tradition is just peer pressure from ancestors." So presumably that would be a Marxist meme.
Only because it works. I mean, there's no harm in changing, because
changing for the better.
Yeah. Because things evolve, of course. Society evolves, technology evolves. You've got to evolve with the technology, but to do it in incremental steps, not to change the entire society for something brand new that's never been tried and tested.
Well, I mean, society has changed a great deal in a very short space of time in terms of information technology. I mean, that's really come out of nowhere, more or less. If you look at the last 2 decades.
And very few people are actually investigating really the ramifications of that.
Yeah.
It has many ramifications, from
it's not all good.
A lack of society, that people are getting more isolated, you know. The pub is not so important as it used to be, or even if people are in the pub, they're talking on their smart tablets rather than talking to each other. And
well, the pub was one of the first things to go during the pandemic, wasn't it? I think because they didn't really like the idea of people talking with each other about what was going on.
That's exactly what I said as well. How do you stop people rebelling? You stop them going to the pub. Where do all rebellions start? All rebellions start in the back room of a pub, you know? And they stopped it. And it was fairly obvious what they were doing. It was nothing to do with transmissions of viruses. Yeah, but we can't talk about that on the, you'll get banned if we talk about that on the internet. So we're not allowed to talk about that. Yes, more propaganda. Things you're not allowed to talk about.
Just going back to the Ukraine and Russia, we've not really discussed Zelensky at all in very much detail. I saw him giving an address to the world press, basically, earlier on today. He said the Russians are bombing homes, schools, and hospitals. They are raping women and abducting children. I mean, surely this is blatant propaganda. Yeah, this guy, that's what he's engaging in, isn't it?
There's always propaganda in you know, the first thing that gets distorted in war is the truth.
It just amazes me that we haven't evolved enough as people to see through it. I know some of us can, but still the vast majority of people, I would suggest, are taken in by it all when they watch this sort of thing on the television.
Oh, well, look at the number of people. Look at the number of people who were taken in by COVID and the mask mandates, you know, and you had all these mask Nazis running around that if you dared have a mask,
they're still out there, Ralph.
They're still out there. I've seen them, and they point at you. You're killing my granny. Yeah. You think, hold on a minute. You know, masks are the worst problem in a pandemic ever. You know, that's why at the beginning of the pandemic they said, whatever you do, don't wear a mask because they don't work. Or they don't work when you wear it because you're not going to wear it properly.
And of course, you're oh dear, we're going to get thrown off now. But you're exhaling toxins. The toxin, I think, something like 80% of the toxins we get rid of, we breathe out. So
then
when
he
we
brings
were
them
in
back
this,
in again.
exactly, and the carbon dioxide and all the rest of it, and all the oh, I'm not going to go there. I better not go there.
Yes, we can't go down that route.
Really
You'll
trouble
get banned
myself,
if we do.
I'll go there on the
But yes,
situation
people
of that.
are easily led because this goes right down certain people's streets that they can feel justified, virtuous, that they are the one that's following the rules and you are not the one that's following the rules, and they just love this, and they join on with these bandwagons. We've talked about bandwagons before, that I don't believe in conspiracies so much, but I do believe in bandwagons, and you've only got to set up a bandwagon that is virtuous and people will jump on it. And they jumped on the COVID bandwagon, and they're jumping on this Ukrainian
But
bandwagon.
in a sense, all these bandwagons are a conspiracy, aren't they?
Effectively, because yes, they're self-propagating in that fashion. As it happens, I support Ukraine. However, I don't support it just because CNN says so. I just think Russia has taken a very stupid step in trying to invade their neighbor when they could have gained influence in Ukraine much better in a political or economic fashion rather than invading. I mean, that was just a stupid thing to do. But yes, all of the saber rattling that's gone on from the left, and it makes me very suspicious about the left of society again. That these people who were utter peaceniks, you know, when Trump came around and they said he's a warmonger, he'll take us into a war immediately. And of course, Trump never did. He actually made peace deals in Korea and in the Middle East. And then the first thing, of course, that Biden does is he takes us, well, almost takes us towards a war. And then these people are saber rattling, saying we should go into Ukraine. Hold on a minute, weren't you the peaceniks just, you know, a couple of years ago? And now they're calling for, you know, an invasion of Ukraine from the America and the EU. And you think, hold on a minute, you know.
Yeah. It's like some Orwellian nightmare, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. And that's the problem, that we can't trust our politicians, let alone the legacy media, to be consistent and be logical, because they are tainted as well. I mean, they're not talking about it now. Well, now we can talk about it, because after 18 months of denying that it ever happened, they've now admitted that the information from Hunter Biden is correct. And now we can talk about it. We're talking about his laptop, which he forgot to pick up.
Yeah.
In one of his stoned episodes, he forgot that he ever had one. But on that, he had details about receiving $3.5 million from the richest woman in Russia, the mayor of Moscow's wife. Why did he get that money? It's never been explained what on earth Hunter Biden was doing getting that money from Russia. And of course, 10% went to the big guy, the big guy being his father. And so you have to wonder how tainted. And of course, Hunter Biden was in Ukraine, of course, earning $800,000 a year from Burisma, the oil company in Ukraine. He was working in Ukraine and getting money, backhanders, from the Ukrainians. And with all of that going on, never mind Zelensky, but how tainted is the Biden family regarding this particular war? So when Poland wanted to send aircraft, they wanted to send Su-29s, I think they were, across to Ukraine. It was the White House that blocked it. It was Biden that blocked the move. Now, that might have been a good idea on its own. I don't know. You'd have to debate that, whether it was a good idea to send aircraft to Ukraine or not. However, is Biden making a sound judgment, or is he being influenced by all of these problems he has with his son working in Ukraine and working for Russians? And it's never been explained why he got that money from Russia. And of course, that lady, who was she called? She was Elena Baturina, I think was her name. She's not on the sanction list. So they made this list of oligarchs who are on the sanction list.
Yeah.
She's not on it.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. And you got, hold on a minute. Can you trust our leaders if they are up to their necks in corruption with the very people we're contending with over in Ukraine and Russia? It's a very sad situation.
Okay, Ralph. So just to sort of bring this to an end, one final question for you. Is there any way at all that you can see this extremely volatile situation coming to a swift end?
A swift end, yes. Yeah. That's the question of the century, isn't it? What's going to happen from now on? The easiest way, if someone took out Putin, would be the easiest way. Now, it's not quite so likely. This is half of the problem, that the Russian army is not performing well. Apparently in Russia, the army is, joining the army is the lowest of low. It's not a prestigious job. Same as when I was in Turkey. Again, the army was regarded as being, worse than being, a street cleaner or something.
Wow.
So they didn't get quality personnel going into the army. Apparently the same is true in Russia, because all of the prestige and the money goes to the security services, not to the army or the military in general. And of course, the security services are the Praetorian Guard for Putin. Exactly the same strategy as they had in Rome, throughout the Roman Empire. The military were always viewed as being suspicious because they had all of this power. And of course, the military could just walk into Moscow and demand that you leave. So the emperors and the presidents of Russia have always been fearful of the army, which is why they keep such a powerful security force as their Praetorian Guard. So in Rome, no army was allowed in Rome. They just weren't allowed in Rome, which is why it was such a dangerous act. It was an act of treason, I suppose you would call it, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, because that was forbidden. You weren't allowed to march your army, and the boundary of Rome was considered to be the Rubicon, the small river, which nobody even knows which river it is. But anyway, it's a river somewhere north of Rome. And you were not allowed to take an army across that river because the emperors wouldn't trust anyone coming across. Well, they didn't have emperors in that era, but never mind. The Senate wouldn't trust any army coming anywhere near Rome. And Moscow has the same problem. And so Putin has surrounded himself by the security services, not by the army, and views the army with great suspicion. And the army has always not been underfunded, but certainly not had very much prestige and doesn't get the best candidates working for it. And that hasn't helped them at all. So they're working with, grade 3 or 4 candidates instead of grade 1 or 2. So it's unlikely, I think, that anyone in his security forces will take him out, which is a bit of a shame, although someone from the army could, because I bet they, knowing what's happening in Ukraine a lot more than anyone else, because no one in Russia knows what's happening in Ukraine. There's a complete news blackout in Russia. So nobody knows that cities are being leveled left, right, and center in Ukraine. That information is not being broadcast in Russia. So everyone thinks it's all going swimmingly, just as planned, So everyone is rooting for Putin because, this is the great, not revolution, but the great, what do they call it? The the special something. I forget what they call this invasion. Anyway, they don't call it an invasion. So I don't think, I think he's probably going to last because he has enough people supporting him.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if he starts really losing? So if the Russian army gets pushed out of Ukraine, gets pushed back and back, which they're starting almost to do, you know, let's not say it too soon, but they're starting to push some of the forces back. What does he do then in order to save face? You know, he's becoming a bit like a cornered rat at that stage. Is he going to suddenly compromise, or is he going to suddenly lash out and use something else? You know, is he going to start throwing chemical weapons around or nuclear weapons? And people will say, "Oh, that's, you know, that's ridiculous. Of course, he won't do that." Well, he's already done that twice in Britain. He's used chemical weapons twice in Britain, let alone anywhere else. Okay, it was only on a small scale, but it proves that he's quite happy, or his security forces are quite happy to use chemical weapons if necessary.
You're talking about the Salisbury, wasn't it? The Salisbury
Yeah,
incident,
well, both of them. There was Lyshenko in London, who was poisoned with plutonium. No, polonium. Different chemical. Sounds the same, but different. Much more difficult to trace. If it had been plutonium, I think people would have known about it much earlier. So yeah, he was poisoned with polonium. And then, yeah, down in Salisbury, they used Novichok to knock out this guy by putting it on the handle of his house. And then, of course, he took it, having opened the handle of his house. They then took it to the restaurant and this car and various other sites all around Salisbury. And so there was a very, very powerful neurotoxin spread all over Salisbury. And the Russians were quite happy with that. So, I mean, it would make him an even greater international pariah if he did do that. But he's a pariah anyway. He's already been excluded from the world's society and the world's economics. So what does he care anymore? The question then becomes, is if he gave the command, would the people ground actually follow it? You know, are there more rational people down below who wouldn't necessarily? But that's a dangerous game. You know, if you don't follow his command, you're not going to last long. You know, and we come back to was it Sting with his back in the 90s with his song, "We Hope the Russians Love Their Children Too." Very poignant song about the Cold War. But that's what we've got again. We've got a Cold War where we don't know what the opposition are going to do because we've ostracized him from the rest of society. And we've just got no clue what he's up to. And that's why Sting wrote his song, you know. We were sitting there on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, and he was singing, "Well, I hope their Russians love their children too, because they're not going to survive either." I'm hoping it won't come to something like that. I'm hoping that Putin will come to his senses and try and negotiate some sort of compromise deal about Donetsk or something, and the Ukrainians agree to it, Zelensky. But in Zelensky's position, why would you agree to it? If you've managed to push a superpower back out of your country almost, why would you agree to any terms? And that is another danger. So, you know, would you get overzealous army commanders in Ukraine or Zelensky himself charging across Moscow to punish the Russian troops as they're retreating? And now you get Ukraine invading Russia. And then, of course, all hell could break loose. So one hopes that there are sort of level-headed people in this, that when it comes to its final conclusion, that they can agree something sensible and not let the hotheads, the hotspurs in Shakespearean language, have their way. because there are too many hotspots around there. Even, you know, on CNN and various other outlets, there's too many of them.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. As always, very, very insightful, fascinating stuff. Thank you. Please like, share and subscribe if you've enjoyed that. And we'll be back very soon with another video. Thanks very much. Cheers, Ralph.
My pleasure, Paul.